All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's terrific to see so many people here. I hope your quarter is starting well. My name is Daisy DeLogo. I'm the faculty director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And it's my privilege to introduce the introducer. So the Outstanding Speaker Series is an annual lecture that brings to the university scholars, professionals, activists, and public figures who've made significant contributions to and on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community. We hope this series will expand public discourse around gender and sexuality at the university and beyond, and that the people and work we feature will serve as an inspiration to students, providing new opportunities and frameworks for future scholarship and public engagement. The series was established and endowed by UChicago Alumni Pride in collaboration with the center, and I want to thank the board and membership of UChicago Alumni Pride for their commitment. I particularly love this series because, as you might have gathered, it offers the opportunity to honor two extraordinary people. As part of the Outstanding Speaker Series, a University of Chicago student is selected each year to receive the LGBTQ plus Community Engagement Award, which recognizes exceptional contributions to advancing and supporting the interests of the LGBTQ plus community. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you this year's award winner, Pietro Juvara. So Pietro is a fourth-year undergraduate majoring in gender and sexuality and law, letters, and society. He's played a role in student activities since his first year at UChicago, and in February 2022, he co-founded the Organization of LGBTQ plus Students, OLS, of which he currently serves as co-president. The OLS promotes sociability and provides advocacy for its members. Since its inception, OLS has hosted over 20 major events, including panels on queer sexual health, discussions about how to maintain one's religious beliefs while belonging to the LGBTQ plus community, Thanksgiving banquets for students who prefer not to return home over the break, an annual Valentine's Day mixer, and the Smart Gala, held in collaboration with and hosted by the Smart Museum. Pedro's worked in HIV healthcare advocacy and treatment with the Center for Disease Control and in HIV policy with the AIDS Foundation of Chicago and Pride Action Tank. Most recently, Pedro was a Gregory Shapin Public Health Fellow at Howard Brown Health, working with the advocacy team to draft federal legislation protecting the 340B federal drug pricing program. 340B, as you might not know, ensures that community healthcare centers like Howard Brown obtain access to discounted drugs so that they're able to serve patients without insurance and to focus on underfunded healthcare like gender-affirming care. Pedro helped revise the 340B Access Act, which will be on the floor of Congress this fall or next year. He also wrote a blog accessible to the public about the legal challenges to LGBTQ plus healthcare. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming Pietro Juvara, who will in turn introduce tonight's speaker. Here is your...
Thank you so much. That would be great. Thank you so much, Casey. Wow, thank you so much. I'm genuinely so grateful to be here and to see so many faces joining me tonight. I'm just so grateful to have been given the opportunity to speak to you and to have some of my work recognized. It means the world to me. So I'd like to first just take a brief moment to thank some of the people who have served as my biggest inspirations and supporters in the last few years of my life. So firstly, the staff and faculty of CSGS and just UChicago Alumni Pride, the sponsors of this award. But I do want to give a special shout out specifically to Bonnie Cantor, who is our wonderful Assistant Director of Student Affairs. I mean, it is truly so rare to meet people who are as kind and as lovely to spend time with as they are wickedly competent. So I could be singing your praises forever, Bonnie. I'd also love to quickly thank Karina Pabon, who's the Assistant Director at the Center for Leadership, who saw something in me and took a chance and nominated me for this award. And last but not least, I could not have accomplished anything without Max and Ptolemy and Dana Christopher, who are two other students who have been my role models since day one and who co-founded the Organization of LGBT Students alongside me. So like Daisy mentioned, which thank you so much for that brilliant introduction, by the way, I'm so touched. I'm Pietro Uvara, however you want to pronounce it, who I'm a fourth year at the college here. And I founded the organization of LGBTQ plus students, and I currently serve as one of its presidents alongside the wonderful Oliver Zajac, who's a second year. Back when I got to campus as a first year, I happened to know that I was queer already. I call it the acceptance journey because I believe it's one that we are never really done with. But I would say that I was decently far along in my acceptance journey when I got to U Chicago. Even still, I came from a high school where I knew maybe four other queer people out of maybe 3,000 students. But at the University of Chicago, I'm overjoyed to say that I have met a lot of queer people, and I mean a lot of queer people. But I realized very quickly that just because I share a community with some of these people and with many of the students at U Chicago doesn't mean that we have remotely similar experiences or feelings on that matter. I met people who had never met another queer person in their life. I met people who could never come out to their family members ever. And I met people who realized that they were queer for the very first time in college. Above all, everybody identifies with some things and not others. I met so many people who loved in the same way that I do, but I felt so disconnected from any sense of unified community. I mean, there is diversity, but there wasn't so much cohesion or unity to us. And I think a lot of other queer students felt the same way. The CI&I did exist at the time, although I only really learned about it in my second year. The CI&I, for those of you who don't know, is the Center for Identity and Inclusion. It's an amazing place. I highly recommend it. But yes, I only learned about it in my second year. As a first year, I'd never even heard of it. And outside of the CI&I, there were no social spaces for the queer community, particularly among students in the college, or none that I knew of, and none that anybody that I had met knew of. So when OLS put on our very first event back in 2022, we saw overwhelming amounts of enthusiasm for the organization. And so many students told me how much it meant to them to have spaces that were dedicated for them, created for them, where they could show up and be surrounded by other people like a family. And even better, after the foundation of OLS, other queer students and other groups emerged onto campus consciousness as well, as people figured out what spaces felt right for them and what groups felt like they called to them. Now I'm happy to say that OLS is just one out of many different queer organizations at U Chicago, each of them allowing for engagement in a variety of forms. Working with my community has absolutely changed my life. I cannot even put into words what it feels like to have somebody tell you that your work improved their day, much less their college experience or their relationship with their identity. It is just, it is a feeling that I cannot quite describe. And it really galvanized me, and it continues to do so. I mean, this is a very tough school, and being queer in America can be a very tough experience. But it feels so incredibly worth it when you can tangibly improve the space around you and the community that you are a part of. I've incorporated this philosophy into my professional and academic life too. Like Daisy mentioned, I worked with the AIDS Foundation Chicago to improve restroom access to gender nonconforming individuals all across Chicago. And this summer, I had the incredible opportunity to be selected as a fellow at Howard Brown Health, which is the oldest and one of the largest queer health and advocacy organizations in the entire world. And there I helped to write new federal legislation to lower the cost of life-saving drugs and preventative care like pre-exposure prophylaxis, also known as PrEP. And that legislation will be brought to Congress this fall, which is just, again, I'm speechless at it. I wish I could say, though, that I have seen similar levels of change from my professional work as I have on this campus in the last 2 years. I mean, to me, the landscape at U Chicago, the queer landscape, looks radically different than when I came here. But improving a country and changing a country is significantly more complicated than improving a campus. The rise in anti-gay and anti-trans legislation has been devastating to us. And while I absolutely plan to continue to fight for my rights and the rights of my community, I feel as though I am just getting started on this path. And it's been a pleasure to share some of that with you today. But because I'm just getting started, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce our guest speaker today. Not just somebody who has taken a few steps down this path, but is actively leading the way towards a safer and more compassionate future. Imani Rupert-Gordon, our wonderful guest speaker tonight, is the executive director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. a legal organization that protects and secures the civil rights of the LGBTQ plus community through legislative policy, litigation in court, public education initiatives, and much more. Prior to her current position, Imani also served as the executive director of Affinity Community Services, which is a social justice organization with deep roots in Chicago and specifically the Chicago South Side, as well as the director of the Broadway Youth Center, which is part of my favorite organization, Howard Brown Health. And Broadway Youth works with queer youth experiencing housing instability. One thing that I would say sets Imani apart from her predecessors and her peers is the lens with which she approaches advocacy work. Rather than coming at this as a lawyer or a politician from within the system, she's worked on the ground with members of the community. She comes from a background in social working, getting her MSW at UChicago's very own Crown Family School of Social Work. To me, Imani represents a new and revolutionary approach to community engagement, something that I believe inspires me every day. So please join me in excitedly welcoming Imani Rupert-Gordon. Have a good speech.
Hi, Anne. Hydra, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so generous. Thank you. Thank you. Y'all, I'm happy to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. And let me just say hey. When I first got here, one of the ways that Chicago really started feeling like home to me was when I started working at Affinity. And I remember just trying to feel like find myself. And I remember Anne just out of nowhere, we were supposed to be meeting for somewhere. You were supposed to be dropping off a key, and I didn't answer. And she came to my house and was like banging on this door because she was worried about me. And it was just the sweetest thing. I just wasn't. It was when I felt like I was part of this community. It just meant a lot to me. Thanks for coming. Y'all, it's great to see you. So it is an enormous pleasure to be here. First, I want to thank Gina. Thank you so much for the invitation. I know it took a lot of back and forth for us doing it, but it is an honor to be here. And Tate, I tell you a while ago, thank you so much for coordinating everything, making this happen. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight and sharing your evening with me and with all of us. My name is Imani Rupert-Gordon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the president of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. I'm excited to be here tonight because I get a chance to talk about something that means, Anna, great to see you. Great to see you. Y'all, this is just like home to me. I'm so happy right now. I'm excited to be here because I get to talk about something that I care a lot about. And this just feels like home to me. My wife and I got married here. We built a home here. My friends became family here. It's just an honor to be back. But also, when I started working in student affairs. And so speaking to students remains one of the my most favorite things to do. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to talk to you all about because I think this is something that matters. And so today I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about the amazing organization that I have the honor of leading. I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've done, the work that we're doing, and the work that I think is going to put us in a place where we are bringing folks in the world and taking good care of our kids. I want to talk more broadly about the national LGBTQ movement, and I want to talk about what our opponents are doing. And I really want to spend some time with that because I think so often when we have these talks, we list these things, we talk about all the anti-LGBTQ bills, and we say terms like DEI, intersectionality, and we don't always know what we're talking about. We're not always talking about the same things. And, like you mentioned, Petra, I am not a lawyer. I lead a legal organization and I'm a social worker. So what that means is that I have to read a lot. I have to listen a lot so that someone can explain something to me because it's hard to understand legal concepts when you haven't been to law school. But it's worth doing because I tell my team all the time, I am a regular smart person and I'm part of our community. So if I don't understand what we're doing, then we're not doing it right. And so the idea here tonight, and I tried to spend some time with this, is about telling you what we're up against in regular language. And we're looking at a legal landscape, but hopefully that's going to be something that's going to be accessible to folks. And then I'm going to tell you about some of the things that I think that we should be doing as well, because I think that's important. And lastly, because I think it's the responsibility of everyone who considers themselves to be part of a civil rights and social justice movement to be creating a pipeline for the folks that come next. And so I'm going to talk to you about what's at stake and why we need you in the pipeline. But the thing about pipelines is they kind of only work when you're already in the system. But when you are outside waiting to get in, I know for a lot of us, we don't always feel like we have that space in. And I really want to be part of your leadership journey as you figure out how you want to go in. And so when I think about access, I think about not just creating pipelines or telling you that we need you in the movement, but making these pipelines accessible to you. And if we really want to contribute to social justice movements, we have to create robust opportunities for that to be possible. And when I speak to young professionals, the question that I get most often is about leadership. People want to know what they can do, and often they want to know how to be an executive director. And I just love that. And so as part of opening this pipeline and making it more accessible, I want to share some things that I learned on my leadership journey. Some helped me be a better leader, some helped me be a better person, and some helped me be both. And by the end of this, I hope that you'll understand a bit more about why and how our opponents are coming after our community and what we're going to do to stop them. But I also hope that you might get something out of this that might help you on your leadership journey as well. And with any luck, the fight for social justice is going to be one that you choose to. Now, to get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do at the National Center for Lesbian Rights and why it's important. So first, when people hear the National Center for Lesbian Rights, they assume that we highlight the experiences for lesbian, and that's not entirely true. It's not only true, I should say. NCLR is a nonprofit law firm and a legal organization, and we were founded 47 years ago. And we were specifically created during a time when the needs of queer and non-binary women were ignored in what was then known as the gay rights movement. These women were left out because the women, because of their of the gay rights movement, because of their experiences as women, and they were left out of the women's rights movement because of their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And they needed an intersectional organization before the term intersectionality was even coined. And NCLR was created to fill that gap. And so our earliest work was protecting the rights of women that were leaving their relationships with men and starting relationships with women. And I know that a lot of folks understand that when that was happening, they would also lose custody of their kids. That was actually something that I learned at Affinity when I was just talking to some folks, and folks had actually lost their kids because of this. And so our earliest work was creating case law and setting good precedent. So that means that setting examples so that if this happens again, that there's something else, that there's something before it that says, hey, we already did this. And so the plan was to set good case law so it would be possible for folks to be able to keep their kids. So anytime you see more than 2 names on a birth certificate, when you see people with the same gender on a birth certificate, when you see protections for surrogates, that's all early NCLR work. And we did this because we knew, and this is the thread through all of our work, and I think this is important because this needs to happen with everything, is that when you center people that are experiencing the highest levels of marginalization, then everyone's stronger for that. And so the work that we did that was protecting those queer women, that work keeps all families stronger. That means LGBTQ families and non-LGBTQ families, all stronger because of that. All people of all genders. And that is the thread that we see through our work. So when many people think that we only do work for lesbians, it's true that we center lesbians in ways that we don't always see other organizations do, but we're celebrating this year 30 years of our immigration and asylum program. And we are the first legal organization to have an immigration and asylum program specifically for LGBTQ people, because we knew that it would be harder how it actually happened is that it was possible for the very first time for LGBTQ people to seek asylum in this country. And because it hadn't happened 30 years ago, there was also no one that knew how to do it. And we were a legal organization that helped got that passed. So we were just like, well, okay, we'll do it. And so we just have the oldest program for that reason, because we just started doing it. And we've never lost an asylum case. We are the first LGBTQ legal organization with a sports program because we knew that LGBTQ people would have a different and harder time playing sports. And we're seeing a little bit of that now, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But this program we started over 20 years ago. And before our opponents made a wedge issue out of trans people playing sports, trans people had been playing in the NCAA for years, and they did it because of a policy that NCLR wrote. And so we know it's possible that everyone can play sports, that everyone will be able to play. We know that that's possible. We're the first to have a conversion therapy program, and we lead that work through our Born Perfect project. When we started the work to end conversion therapy, our legal director came in to do that work. He started as a fellow. He's been here for over 30 years now. When he started, there was no one doing this work, and now there are, it's banned in 22 states and 100 different municipalities. So this is like one of the fastest growing parts of the LGBTQ movement. And then the Transgender Law Center is the oldest trans-led legal organization in the country, and we think it's in the world. And it started as a project of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. We've always known that you have to center the people that are the most underrepresented, and then that protects all of us. And I mention all this and I list this because it's not that I want to take credit for being the first. I want to be really clear here. We are a small national organization, but we have an enormous footprint. I mention this because I want this to serve as a reminder that you don't have to be the largest organization to be a leader. You don't have to be at the top of the organization to make change. It matters that you are creating a blueprint and you are moving forward so folks have something to follow. If you push to be inclusive in the most strategic way, then you can give everyone that roadmap to follow. And that's what happened, because now there are tons of organizations doing LGBTQ asylum work, tons of folks doing conversion therapy work, tons of folks doing sports work. And they did that because there was a blueprint about what that looked like. And before you know it, when you do that, you will have a movement full of people that are doing their work a little bit better and include a little bit more of us than they did before. And so I'm not interested in being the first, I'm interested in changing the world. And that's how NCLR does that. And now I want to talk about the attack on LGBTQ people and how that's playing out for us right now. One of my favorite metaphors was created by someone named Marian Iris Young, and she talks about multiple forms of oppression and uses a metaphor about a birdcage. And Michelle Alexander later made it a bit more mainstream in one of my favorite books of all time, The New Jim Crow. But it basically goes like this. When you look at a single wire in a birdcage, one singular aspect of oppression or disadvantage, it's difficult to understand how a single wire could limit a bird. However, when you step back and you're able to see a birdcage in its entirety, it's easy to understand how the wires work together, how each is connected in such a way where every single vertical wire connects to every single horizontal wire over and over again. And from this perspective, when you understand it in this full context, when you see all the wires together, it's easy to understand how and why the bird is trapped. And I just love that. I think it's such a beautiful way to understand, another version of intersectionality. I was going to take, we'll probably get into some of that, but I took a big part of an intersectional perspective that I typically talk about. But if you have questions, I do have a thing that we can walk through there. But what we want to do is take what's happening with these anti-LGBTQ bills and put them in a larger context. I want us to not just say like, oh, there's over 600 anti-LGBTQ bills, because that's all stuff that you know. And we've seen this increase, but I want you to see how these things connect together and how they make not only our lives hard, but everyone's life hard. So for the last several years, we've seen an increase in these anti-LGBTQ bills, which each year surpassing the last year. And we're not going to talk about that sheer number. We're going to talk about what these bills do. And there's a lot of anti-LGBTQ bills, but the ones that we predominantly talk about are the medical bans, the sports bans, and the don't say gay or trans bills. But there are still pronoun bills, there are still bathroom bills, there are still forced outing bills, there are some other ones there, but largely these are the three that we talk about. And this is important because I think we get questions about these a lot. Hey, Toy, great to see you. So first are medical bans. These are bans that prevent trans people from getting the medically necessary healthcare that they need. And these laws exist in half of the states in this country. But for clarity, the healthcare that folks would be receiving is backed by science. It is completely safe. There are strict standards of care that they must abide by. And this care is endorsed by every single medical association, every single one. So it's not that it's not safe. Medical bans are going to get some extra coverage right now because the first medical ban case is going to be heard by the Supreme Court this winter. And we can expect a decision by June. So typically LGBTQ decisions come out in the Supreme Court in Pride Month is what happens. If you want to look it up, it's called United States versus Scrimeti, or just call it Scrimeti. But they're basically asking the court this one question, and that is, do medical bans unfairly target transgender people? That's what it boils down to. It's going to sound a little bit more complicated if you read it, but that's what it boils down to. And the honest answer here is that it does. And I want to tell you about that because this is the part that no one tells you. And I actually had to do quite a bit of digging and talk to quite a few people to kind of piece this together. And I think that's important. Do you know who gets puberty blockers with no problem or fanfare? Everyone besides trans people. Young people go to puberty in early ages. That happens sometimes, that they go into puberty like sometimes 4, 5, 6 years old. We don't hear it that much because it's about 1% of the population. But when they do, they get puberty blockers because they're absolutely safe and there's no problem with them. We know that everyone gets hormone replacement therapy. If you are not a trans person, it's very easy to get hormone replacement therapy. We know that cis men and cis women have lower levels of testosterone, and when they do, they just go get hormone replacement therapy. If someone's going through menopause or perimenopause, they just go get hormone replacement therapy. It's actually super easy to do because it's medical care that you need, because it's completely safe. So people across this age spectrum, they get the exact same care that are being denied to trans people, and the government doesn't step in at all. And the government shouldn't step in because in each of these examples, these people have a medically necessary reason to receive the care. And so they just get the care. These are personal decisions that are made between families and caregivers and doctors, and they should be for everyone. So keep an eye out about this because this is a really big case. But I also want you to be able to know when people say, a lot of our opponents use words like, when we say gender affirming care in spaces like this, we all tend to know what we mean and it's not that big a deal. But when we're talking around people that don't think like us, that don't speak like us, they don't always know what gender affirming care is. And when they don't, they can say things like, oh, that's weird, or that's some sort of special care and it's not safe and all these things. But when we just talk about it as just healthcare for people, it matters the messaging that we use. And we're just talking about healthcare like we do for everyone else, because the 5-year-old that needs puberty blockers or hormone blockers, that's the same exact medical care that these trans folks need. And so let's not let our opponents trip us up about these things. Like we're not asking for anything special. We're just asking for things to be equitable. The next things are sports bans. And these are laws that ban trans people, specifically trans girls, from playing sports. And they're categorical bans with no consideration for the specific circumstances to the individual girl. And just because this person is transgender, they're banned from playing sports. And those two are happening in about half of the states in this country. So this includes young girls that haven't gone through puberty or folks that are on puberty blockers. And it's painful because a lot of times these folks have only ever played on girls' teams, and these bans are just a disruption. And the truth is, we're talking about kids, and we are talking about so few kids that just want to play games, that just want to play sports. There was an article that came out a few years ago, and the reporter asked the governors who had signed these bills into law if they could name an example of this coming up in their state. And not one governor that signed this bill into law could name a time that this actually came up. They were just mean laws, that they were just excluding kids so these kids never had a chance. It wasn't even coming up in their state. Governor Cox of Utah openly opposed allowing trans kids playing sports. But when it came down to signing the bill into law, he didn't do it. He wrote this beautiful letter, and if you can, I would encourage you to read it. But in one part, he said, 70,000 kids in the state play sports, and there are 4 openly trans kids. And he says, 4 kids, and only one of them is playing girls' sports. That's what all of this is about. 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships. 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they're part of something. 4 kids that are just trying to get through each day. And if you get a chance, please do read that. He went on to discuss the connection between mental health and explain that he's a father of girls and his responsibility of taking care of kids. And I want to be clear here because we're talking about very few people. And I'm saying that because, if I spent my time, like spending all of my time just being mean and talking to such a small percentage of the folks that I work with, I would lose my job because that's a ridiculous way to spend time. But I also want to be clear that I'm not saying that we can't have a discussion about fairness in sports. Dialogue should always be welcome. But I have to say this discussion around safety in sports seems like a disingenuous one. And I also want to give a trigger warning here because I'm going to briefly mention sexual assault in about 40 seconds. It's very well documented that women don't have comparable facilities to men. It's been long and well documented that women aren't paid equally or even close to men at the same level. I just read Brittany Griner's book, and she details her time in a Russian prison for a mistake. She packed something that she shouldn't have, and for that, she was in a Russian prison for 9 months. But she was only there because she makes 80% of her yearly income playing basketball overseas. And many WNBA players do that. The men at their same level don't have to do that. The women just don't make enough money. And lastly, women at every level of sporting have outsized reports of rape and sexual assault by their coaches. All of these have been thoroughly investigated, reported on, and cited as problems by women. I'm not saying that we can't have conversations around safety and fairness, but if we are, let's start with the issues that women have been raising for literal decades first. Trans folks playing sports, and they've been playing sports for years with absolutely no problems. At the time that this is coming up, we're having an all-out coordinated attack on trans kids, and I just don't buy that this is about trans kids playing sports and about safety in sports. And while our opponents are coming after trans kids right now, let's remember that it wasn't so long ago that they were coming after gay men in locker rooms. It wasn't so long ago that they were coming after Black masculine of center women in sports and people that are intersex. Remember, what our opponents are doing right now isn't new. And we need to recognize that when our opponents are coming to us and saying that these things aren't fair. We have to do what we always have done, and that is to protect our folks. And finally, the last bill I want to talk about is the anti-LGBTQ bill, is the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill. These bills purport to protect parents from having their kids taught about sexual orientation and gender identity. They say because they want some say in how this is talked about, and they have an option to sue a school district if they believe that the policy is violated. Now, of course, this doesn't take in consideration that also means that LGBTQ students and students with LGBTQ parents wouldn't have their identities or the identities of their family reflected into the curriculum, creating an intentional way to alienate these students. One of the reasons that Don't Say Gay or Trans laws are so dangerous is because these bills are intentionally vague. You don't know what violates the law, and teachers are afraid to talk about their LGBTQ identities. They're afraid to have a picture of their spouse on their desk. They're taking down posters of prominent LGBTQ figures and refusing to sponsor gender and sexuality alliances. And they're doing it because they're not clear what you can be fined for. And these are teachers, and they just want to take care of their students. But the concern here is that none of these things that they're alleging would be happening anyway. Don't Say Gay in Florida was one of NCLR's cases, and I had a donor call me and say, after we sent an email out, and she said, I always agree with you, but this time I don't. She said, I don't believe that kindergartners should receive sex education. And that's why this is so dangerous, because no one wants that. And it wouldn't happen because sex ed is not part of a kindergarten's curriculum. And they're just saying this stuff. They're just saying it, and it's not true. But what is part of the curriculum? It's drawing pictures of what you did over the weekend. What is part of the curriculum is writing a story about the people in your life, about the people who you love and who love you. And when you put it into that context, how we experience these laws, it's easy to see how we're leaving out LGBTQ people in a very intentional way. But there's a connection here that I think is important, and it's around education and whose history is taught. We have to acknowledge that when we hear the same historical figures over and over again, the same life-changing events, that reinforces their importance to us. Most of us knew about the Boston Tea Party before we knew what taxes were. But it works the other way too. when we don't hear about the history and the contributions of groups. It's not neutral. We don't just learn about them sometime later without an enormous cost to us. Many times people never learn about it. Then these students feel alienated, and it teaches students that LGBTQ people don't exist or that LGBTQ people haven't done things that are worthwhile. It's damaging and it's dangerous. And when you combine these efforts with the efforts that we've seen to ban books and to eliminate histories of LGBTQ people, of Black people and communities of color, people that have immigrated to this country, we can see that this is coordinated and it's intentional. When we keep our identities out of school, and let's be clear, it's not all of our identities, because there's no question that the identities of straight people will still be in school, of cis people will still be in school, the histories of white people will still be in school. So when we do this, not only do students grow up believing that someone like them aren't intricately woven into the fabric of this country, but their classmates growing up believing the exact same thing, that we haven't made significant contributions when our contributions have been enormous. Right now, there's a war on critical race theory. And if you look at the research, most people that oppose it don't actually understand what it is. We're in a place where we can have strong opinions and dismiss important initiatives without even understanding what they are. This year, the Supreme Court decision made affirmative action illegal in universities. And the settlement in the Fearless Fund ended an initiative that was providing funding for Black women business owners. The reasons is that they said that it wasn't fair. But we have to remember that affirmative action, CRT, these things were created to level the playing field and to understand how racism is embedded in it. And now it's being cited for making the playing field uneven. The Fearless Fund was started as an initiative funding Black women that are starting businesses because Black women make up less than 1% of business owners, and only 3% make it past the 5 years mark. The ironic thing is that if more of us understood what critical race theory is, and it would allow us to understand the impact of institutional oppression and how it starts in our education system. It would be obvious how sinister and insidious this law is because they're playing in our face. And if this were a science fiction story, right now is when we would be learning that the things that we think are protecting us are the things that are actually destroying us. And lastly, when we see these bills moving through Congress and being signed into law by governors that are keeping trans kids from playing sports and limiting medically necessary healthcare for kids, it's easier to understand how this can happen when we look back and the experiences of LGBTQ people and people of color, the most underrepresented folks, are being limited in schools. That is intentional. We shouldn't be in a place where we are voting about who gets rights and who isn't. But if we write people out of curriculums when we are in a space where we think we're getting an entire accurate history, then it's easier when you turn 18 and you're voting for rights, which we shouldn't be doing anyway, but it's easier to leave these folks out. Excluding groups from our educational system is the first step in normalizing discrimination. And it's not surprising that a large majority of the anti-trans bills are aimed at kids or aimed at parents as they are supporting their trans kids, or doctors as they're providing medically necessary care. So when we look back at history, many of us are saying, how could this ever happen? But it's happening right now in our face. This is what institutional discrimination looks like, and we're watching it play out right now. And this is what these bills do. They're threats to racial justice through ending of DEI and affirmative action, the rollback of Roe and the Dobbs decision, limiting abortion and bodily autonomy. These are all part of a larger system of controlling our community so that we get used to censoring ourselves. We get used to asking for permission for our own bodily autonomy. But you see, when we're distracted with the sheer number of anti-LGBTQ bills, and we're listing the 637 that have been introduced, then we miss that they're out here building a birdcage right under our nose. And so that leaves us with what's next? What should we be doing? And I'd like to leave you with a few things to consider. First, and I mentioned this before, messaging is important. We have to speak about our issues in a way that persuades people to join our side. So often we are so busy talking about concerned with our position, what we want people to understand, that we lose sight that our responsibility is to allow folks to shift their opinion so that they can include more of us and not yell at them and think that they should think more like us. I mean, I understand that we want to from time to time, but when we also realize that people's lives are resting in our decisions, and if we are able to bring more people to our side. And when we say that, then you know what? I have a little bit more space to hear someone out and bring them to our side instead of just saying, you know what, you're not right and you're an idiot. Though, that has its time too. But I think that what is so powerful about this and this tactic is that we have fairness and equity on our side. These are some of the most powerful values we can have, and we have them on our side. We're fighting for civil rights and social justice. Like, what's better than that? Like, we're the superheroes in this story. And if we get our opponents to put their guards down, research shows that 8 out of 10 people across political parties believe in rights and protections for LGBTQ people. Most people agree with us. We just have to get them to the space where they actually can agree with us. And this is important because if I was an individual with a clipboard, I would have a completely different strategy about what I'm doing. But I'm a person that's part of an organization, and organizations don't have egos. They don't have feelings. My responsibility is to get as many people as we can to support our folks. We build a foundation so that we have something. I'm going to go off script a little bit, but we talk about Justice Ginsburg, about the amazing, amazing things that she did. And if you go into her story, it's actually pretty interesting if you haven't before, but she wanted to do some gender justice work. And so for her, she was creating precedent. And so she had to find a strategic way to do that. And so for her, she was finding ways to support men. What she was doing is, finding ways to get men's spousal support. And at the time, people were like, that's how we're spending our time, but that's what she did. There's this case, it's kind of a funny one. There was a place, I think it was in Indiana, but there was a college, and there was this little market that sold this beer that it was like, beer is usually like 6 to 7% alcohol. This is like 1 or 2% alcohol. But they would sell this beer and they would sell it to women that were 18 because women were more responsible. And men had to wait until they're 21 to get this 1-2% beer. And of course, there were women that were like, really? This is how we're gonna do this. But what she did was just really intentional about creating a foundation, creating precedent so that there was precedent there about this gender justice work. And so when it came to protecting women about things that actually mattered, not buying 2% beer, but the actual rights and autonomy, that there was precedent that she already created there. That's what I try to think about in our work. How do we create a precedent? How do we make it easier for the people after us? Because as much as we want things to just happen like this, I mean, I get that it's not fun to think about, this incremental change. But if we look at the history of our civil rights movement, that's the only way anything has ever happened. And so while I'm okay with everything, if you're like, I'm going to be the person that does it, you know what, more power to you, I would love to see it. I'm going to do this way, and we all need to do something. And, the last thing I'll say too is that sometimes we get so critical with each other about when we have different strategies for getting our work done. If we were to list civil rights leaders right now, we would list the same people over and over again. We probably wouldn't each come up with a different person. We'd list people over and over again. And if we took that list and we thought, okay, in the time that they were doing work, how much did they like working with each other? And isn't that because we can read how much they were so frustrated with each other, but we can't talk about civil rights without listing them all together. And so if you think that you have a new way to do it, I'm all about it. Like, I'm all about it. But I actually want you to know that I have my own way of doing things too. There's space for all of us. And we need that. We need that in justice work. So lastly, the thing I wanted to say is that you'd be surprised at the work that you can do when you work behind the scenes. So much of this work ends up being performative, and I wish that it weren't. But if you can have discussions behind the scenes and build relationships, you can make allies that will help you over and over again. One of our programs is called Common Ground, and it's a partnership that we have with NCAA, and it's a group of a small group of LGBTQ leaders and leaders from conservative universities. We all come together and just learn from each other and have discussions. During one of these gatherings, the president of the university was explaining that she didn't have any LGBTQ, that she didn't understand any of this. You're all good. This doesn't apply to her because she didn't have any LGBTQ students at her school, which sounds really funny to us because obviously she has LGBTQ students at her school, but she honestly had no idea. And so one of the LGBTQ leaders shared her experience of feeling alienated when she went to that school and what it felt like to be a queer athlete there. And the president of the university was shocked and she was heartbroken. She cried in that meeting. Not saying, sometimes people cry. It's okay. Like, people have emotions. And I'm not saying that the president shouldn't have known that she obviously had LGBTQ students. I don't know how you're a president of a university and not know it, but such is life. And we can make the argument that she should have known. Absolutely. Or we can understand where she is now and ask her how she feels about that. And that's what we did. And as a result of those conversations, Azusa Pacific University removed naming LGBTQ students in their policies explicitly, no longer saying that being LGBTQ violates their policies. Both Azusa and BYU changed their policies to allow LGBTQ students and clubs to meet on campus. Now, of course, this isn't everything and it's not even close, but this changes the experience for the LGBTQ people there. It makes a very real difference for them. And we have to remember, sometimes we hear the arguments, well, just go to another school. But they don't have to go to another school. Sometimes people choose schools because of their faith, because it's important to them, because they're playing sports, because the name speaks to them. People are able to make those decisions for themselves, and nothing should be able to stop that. We need to make it possible for all of us to live in public life easily and authentically. We talk about a lot what's going wrong with the world, but less about how we can help. And I know that that can feel overwhelming. But I remember someone told me once, we don't have to do everything. We just have to do our part. And when you say it like that, it just feels more manageable. And when I think about my part, I have to ask myself, where do I want to be when I look back and today is history? Right now, we should all be thinking about what we can do as individuals and as a collective because our lives are literally at stake. In moments like this, it's imperative that leaders recognize what they have to offer and give it freely and as often as possible. When the stakes are so high, it seems hard to figure out where we can help and where we can fit in. These are 3 things that I like to consider when I am trying to be a better leader and show up for community. And this is a special one-of-a-kind top 3 list, mostly because there's 4 things on it. So first is how to be the first and not the last. I love it when people say this, and I always will. Reminding girls everywhere to watch your step because there's glass on the floor. I will never not smile when I see that. I just think it's so cute. Because for many of us, we've never seen someone like us in positions that we one day hope to occupy. I know very smart people that mentor people to take their place. And when they say, I'll be the first but not the last, it's because they've coached someone and prepared someone to take their place. But I'm not sure that that's the best way to ensure that you're not the last. We need to find ways to be truly intersectional. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned the importance of creating pipelines. When we're ensuring that we're the first and not the last, we're talking about systems change. If we're truly dedicated to creating pipelines, we have to make it possible for folks to have access freely to an open door and to be in these positions, not just be given access to someone that has a key or someone that, now NCLR can be run by a social worker because it's been done before. This has to be like, what I hope is that NCLR and other organizations can be run by a lot of non-lawyers and they don't have to be a social worker at all. So for me, I think about what it means to create a more inclusive environment. And that means valuing lived experience and giving just as much credit to formal education and lived experience whenever it's possible. Sure, when we have to hire a lawyer, that won't work. You need a law degree. But there's a lot of amazing policy work that doesn't need that. And it really does matter that someone has a lived experience. It means encouraging people to apply to jobs and writing that on the job description. We have something like this written on our job description. Research shows that women, transgender, non-binary people, people of color, and people from underrepresented identities are less likely to apply to jobs if they don't feel like they can check off everything on the job description. If you believe you can do this job, we want your application. Sometimes you have to make it that clear for folks to let you know that we want you. It means that we're looking at who's not at our tables and creating ways to change that, even when it's uncomfortable. The second thing I want to mention is to know what you bring to the table. When I stepped in my role, something that came up a lot is not that I'm the first Black person to lead the organization, because that's true too, but that I'm the first non-lawyer to lead the organization. Many of the questions that I fielded during the interview process was be how I would make up for the fact that I am not a lawyer and I'm leading a law firm. And it's a legitimate question. I get it. An organization has existed for 47 years, only been led by lawyers. A departure from that is definitely something to consider. And I was spending an awful lot of time convincing people not only that it should be me, which is what you expect to do when you are applying for a job or telling people you're applying for a job, but I was spending time in explaining to people that it could be me. And I see examples of people doing this all the time, but my favorite one is kind of a funny one by Gabrielle Union in an old interview. She was much less popular at this time, but still lovely. She was sharing what it was like to prepare for an audition. And she was talking about what she does to get ready. She starts off by saying that she loves Janet Jackson. And that's amazing because I love Janet Jackson. So for her to prepare for the audition, she becomes Janet Jackson. She has a playlist of Janet Jackson songs. She gets the perfect makeup. She even has her makeup artist add a little Janet Jackson birthmark. And on the ride there, she's blasting Janet. And by the time she gets to the audition, she's feeling it. And she's ready to present the best version of herself. And I think a lot of us know what that feels like. That's a good feeling, you know? And so when they call her into the room for the audition, she's ready. And when she's walking through the door, as she's walking in, the person that auditioned before is walking out just as she's walking in. And of course, that person's Janet Jackson. And her heart just sinks. Because it's only in that moment that she realizes that she's not presenting the best version of herself. She's presenting the second best Janet Jackson they've seen. And if you're looking for Janet Jackson, you're not looking for the person that's trying to be Janet Jackson. And at first I didn't realize it, but whenever anyone asked me how I could be successful in this position as a non-lawyer, they were asking me to be the second best Janet Jackson. And I could have easily fallen prey to that. Questions like, well, who will the legal director talk to about your cases? Or how will I lead a team of lawyers if I'm not one? Well, our legal director is, best in the movement. And that's not hyperbole. Like, he really is the best in the movement. No one would argue that he's top three. But he doesn't talk to him. Like, he wouldn't be talking to this person anyway. Or how would I lead a team of lawyers? Well, they're people, right? I've led people. So like lead a team? Got it. Nothing, like not magicians or anything. Like they're just people. I can do that. And I don't know that they realized it either, but they could only imagine my success being measured by how closely I resembled the last executive director, as opposed to what I could uniquely bring to this role and how I too could be good for this organization. And the ways that I've been successful in my role have nothing to do with what the previous person did. And she was amazing. But I just spent the last 30, 40 minutes explaining legal work to non-lawyers in a way that we can understand. That's better for NCLR, it's better for the movement, it's better for all of us. And I did that not because I was trying to lead like someone else, but because I was just leading like me. And I'm not saying this to tell you how awesome I am. This is, I love this place. Thank you all. I'm saying this because every single one of us has something amazing to share with this world. I believe there's a leader in all of us, and we just have to make sure that we create the space for someone to lead, sometimes in ways that we've never seen before. So it sounds cliche to say, but be yourself. and make sure that the metric that you're being measured by is the way that you can calculate success and that it's something that's obtainable to you. We can't all be Janet Jackson, but we can all be phenomenal. And third, when you know something, trust yourself. I wasn't going to mention this one, but Jackie, one of my best friends, is here, and she reminded me recently how important building a pergola was to me. And I hadn't thought about that in a while. And this is, without a doubt, one of the most valuable lessons that I've ever learned in my life. When I lived in Chicago, I wanted a pergola. A pergola is an open air structure. It has an open air roof. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I wanted to design it, and I wanted to build it myself. And when I explained this to some of the people I knew, their response wasn't what I expected. They kind of treated it like a joke, and it was actually quite a bit painful to me. Wasn't you? You were perfect. I have a lot of support in my life, so when I heard this, I really felt it, and it stood out to me. But I just decided to build a pergola. I rented this 25-foot truck. It was the size I had that would carry the things that I wanted. And my hands were literally shaking on the steering wheel. It's scary to drive a truck that big. I drive a coupe. Once I got to the store, I was nauseous thinking about the task in front of me. Really, I almost got sick there. I did not recommend getting sick in the Home Depot. It was not nice. And I was nervous to ask about lifting these 16-foot long, these 16-foot, 100-pound pressure-treated posts. Pressure-treated posts are really heavy. And I was so nervous, I didn't ask for help. And so I lifted all of them myself. And I was shopping in there for over 4 hours because a lot of this was new to me. For the design, I, figured this out and I knew what I was looking for, but I didn't know the names of these supplies. Like I didn't know what they were called. I didn't know that if you could only use them on certain material. I just had an idea of generally how to put this together. And I felt very alone in there. And I'll never forget the day that this went from being piles of stuff in our yard to being erected and creating the most beautiful pergola I'd ever seen. And sitting under the pergola was magical. It was my favorite place at our house. And I never think about the people that never thought that I could do it because, this wasn't about them. I realized that it wasn't that they didn't think that I could build a pergola, not in any real way. I realized that they didn't think they could build a pergola. And the vision that I had so clearly in my head, they couldn't see that at all. And that's okay. Their superpowers are somewhere else. But the lesson here is that I realize that there are times that I can see things that other people can't see. And without a doubt, this is one of the most valuable things that I bring to a team. Ani Nin said, and the day came when the risk to remain in a tight bud was more painful than the risk it took to bloom. But for me, that pergola serves as a reminder that anything is possible and that we can't let someone else's limitations be our limitations. You have to know when it's your time to bloom. And so I cultivate that at work. Everyone on my team knows no one gets in trouble for making a mistake, even the big ones. And if you have an idea of something you want to try, if we can't immediately poke holes in it, I'll probably say yes to it. Because sometimes we don't know what we can do before we try. And giving someone a shot is how we get breakthroughs. But between us, I'm not actually looking for breakthroughs. My goal is to cultivate the most confident team that anyone has ever seen. Because when you have a team of people that sincerely believe they can change the world, you know what they do? They change the world. I tell everyone that once they leave NCLR, they'll be able to lead an organization. And so far, 3 folks have done that since I've been here, and I take a lot of pride in that. And the last one's a short one, and that is that sometimes you just don't know. Before I was an executive director, I was someone that wanted to be an executive director. And I once asked a CEO that I looked up to, and I said, how do you know the right answer or the right things to do? And I asked him after he had made a really hard decision, and it was the right decision, and he got a lot of credit for it. And he told me, I don't. And I remember another time he and I were in a room together. It was a fancy meeting. There were about 15 of us around a table, and there was someone important there. I don't remember who it was, but important enough for me to be nervous. And I was nervous, and I was looking at him, and when it was his turn to speak, the same CEO, I looked at him and he sounded as poised as always. And because I was sitting next to him, I could see his hand under the table, and I could see that his hand was shaking. And no one else saw that. It was just me. And he didn't know that I saw it either. But I like to remember this because often we think that when you become an executive director or CEO, that you just know the right path forward. And this isn't true. I rarely ever make decisions on my own. And in doing this, I like to have the input of the senior team with everything. I want an expert considering everything in their area. And while this takes longer, each decision gets easier because we understand our lanes, but more importantly, our decisions are better. I'm excited to see what the next group of leaders bring to the table and who you bring with you. We must demand that our leaders come not just from our communities, but bring our communities with them as they enter these halls of power. Remember, there are a lot of ways to be part of movement work, and we need you now more than ever. And lastly, I want to just finish with one of my favorite authors. My sister was named Maya after Maya Angelou. And so we read a lot of her work growing up. But one of my favorite quotes goes like this. It says, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." It has been a pleasure being here with you, and I look forward to being better with all of you. Good to see y'all. Thank you. Okay.
Roy, I thank you for the speech. I come from a university in Texas where our local gay and straight alliance tried and failed to break through a drag show ban at our university. We were denied a few injunctions, and it really did feel like a gut punch to feel like litigation wasn't a way forward. So when that kind of when common ground fails with a university president and doesn't succeed like in BYU's case, and when litigation fails, where else do you look to for precedent?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So, litigation is a very powerful tool. And if you talk to a litigator, they're like, this is the only thing that matters. But it's not the only thing that matters. In fact, it's actually a strategy sometimes. I mean, I took so much out of this, but, the Supreme Court right now is, wow, it's really something, isn't it? Um, there is also a strategy about doing what you can to keep things out of the courts. There are some things that are complicated about that, but in times that litigation isn't working, that is a time to think about legislation. It's a time to think about policy change. Sometimes these are hard because now you're working with Congress, which is a whole different thing. But the other part, and this is something really interesting, we also do public education work. And I know we don't always give the same sort of credit when we talk about litigation and legislation and then public education. We don't always talk about that the same way. But when we think about marriage equality, if you were to ask a lawyer what went into marriage equality, they would talk about the years that they went trying to create any sort of precedent around fairness and due process. And this is just, these people don't have the same rights as these people because of their sexual orientation. And they went through all of this. And the thing that actually won, the thing that actually counted was that people love each other and they just want to get married. And that was the thing that broke through. And I think that part is important because we are in a space right now, and we, kind of saw this happening. There are going to be some things that we lose. These anti-LGBTQ bills I mean, they're so horrible that you almost can't not say, okay, well, that's not fair. But at the second level, like in this whole, so it'll go like at a trial level court, and then it'll go to the Court of Appeals. At the Court of Appeals, that is where it's going to be more likely where bias might set in, where you don't have a plaintiff in front of you saying, I am just a kid that wants to play sports. Like I just want to be here with my friends. And when you don't have that, then that's when bias can set in. And sometimes that's when we get a loss. And then that's when things go to the Supreme Court. But I'm saying all of this because we never know when the tide is going to change. We're in a time right now where there are some losses that are happening. We're seeing that in a variety of ways. But we can't give up right now. Now is the time that we have to work harder than ever, because even when there are times that we think that we might lose, we have to make this hard for them. We cannot make it easy, because we know, again, in this history of civil rights, often it wasn't that we had this perfect plan that's like, and then we'll make this argument and we win. But a lot of times it's just working and holding until something changes. Because sometimes it might be a movie, it might be a movie, it might be a character, it might be something. You never know what's going to change that tide. And that's what, Justice Ginsburg was doing, setting a precedent until it was possible for a tide to change. And in the time that we're getting some of those losses, I would say, but we're waiting right now for that tide to change. So we got to work harder than ever, and don't make it easy on them. Anna, E3 Queer News Radio.
Hey, yeah. Okay, I have two questions for you. One, how, if the Equality Act was to actually pass soon, how would that impact all these other laws that we're seeing being introduced in legislatures across the country? Like, what kind of impact would the Equality Act actually have?
Yeah.
And then my second question is around the Don't Say Gay law in Florida. I believe NCLR was part of the litigating team with Equality Florida around the fact that that bill was so incredibly vague. You all fought and won and clarified that bill. And now so many of the things that weren't happening in Florida can happen. GSAs can happen in Florida. That people can have gay characters in plays. I mean, just the most randomness.
Yeah.
How does that win actually set a precedent? And have you seen people begin to use that as a precedent to overturn the other copycat bills, in Texas, Kentucky, all over the country that use DeSantis as a blueprint? Are we seeing it flip the other way and use that win as a precedent to flip those?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. So the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, actually what happened is it was a settlement. Like, we settled this. But what's great about this, I mean, whenever something settles, every side says, oh, we won. But the truth is we won. but here's why. Because Florida's a really tough spot. And so they made this really horrendous bill that really, I mean, this can't be everywhere, but it did happen here. This was a horrible bill. And in this settlement, what we got them to say is that in writing, that all of these things, that you can say gay, that these books aren't banned, or all of these things that they intentionally were working to make it hard on LGBTQ folks. And what happened is that because of this settlement, LGBTQ kids are literally safer than they would have been if they didn't introduce that at all. And I think that part is pretty amazing, because like, you settle in such a way where you are ensuring that LGBTQ kids are taken care of. Like, it actually, from DeSantis's side, it actually would have been better for him to not do something like that. And then they could continue to discriminate against LGBTQ kids, but now they can't. So that was actually something historic and amazing. But because it was a settlement, that's something that's it's not the same about like setting precedent. The other thing is that these are hard to challenge. So when we were looking at all the numbers, the 600 new bills that are introduced every year, the part that we don't talk about is, in 2015, there were 100 anti-LGBTQ bills, and that was a record at the time. So when we see 600 anti-LGBTQ bills, there's so many that we can't actually keep up with them. Because when we talk about who challenges these laws, it's not the law firm down the street. These laws have to be challenged by LGBTQ organizations. There's just a level of understanding that doesn't just exist at law firms. So it's not that we can just go find pro bono law firms and they go and take it. We have to find pro bono law firms that work with with LGBTQ nonprofits. And there's really a handful. And, if we have a supportive administration, they will take some of it. And this administration has taken some. But I'm saying all this because even when they're, the Don't Say Gay or Trans, but that took, probably, I mean, I'm trying to think how long that took. I think it took about a couple of years. It takes some time. It takes some time for these things to happen. But we can't respond to all of them. And, like we did that one, but there's still another, I think there's 11 more across the states. We are handling as many of these medical bans as we can. We're prioritizing medical bans because we know that when kids can't get the medical care they need, that sometimes they don't live. Excuse me. So we're prioritizing those. Excuse me. But we're doing some sportsmen. But I'm saying all this because we don't actually have the person power to challenge every single one. And so we're, as a movement, I know that sometimes people are like, are you all playing fair in the stand? Like, we're playing really well together, and we have to, because we need to be really strategic about which laws we can take and which ones we can. So that doesn't work that well about precedent, but some of this other stuff. So the Scrimeti case, that's going to be huge for us. We put a case in front of the Supreme Court, asked them to take it. There was another case, Tennessee. They ended up taking that case, but it was against the United States, so it's not one of the LGBTQ organizations. But what that means is that this is going to be an answer for all the medical ban cases. So we're waiting for that, and we should get that in June. And you asked one other question. The Equality Act. Yeah. Oh my goodness. If the Equality Act, so something that folks don't realize is that LGBTQ people don't have protections for being LGBTQ. Like, there's a lot of ways where we can be discriminated against in a variety of ways. Now, yes, I would love if the Equality Act passed tomorrow. The other thing is that, the ERA hasn't passed either for 50 years. Like, there's a lot of ways that we think we're a little bit safer than we are. When we're talking about, there are people that said, like, oh, Roe will never fall. Abortion is the law of the land. We'll never have to think about that, until it did, and then it did. And now we're, hustling to get that back, and in a way that can be codified and won't happen like this again. But what this would, and I guess I also want to say this part is not the most popular thing to say, but even when we have like the protections that we need, that doesn't change that discrimination happens. The Bostock decision, I believe that was 2022. That was an enormous decision. And what Bostock did was, it meant that sex discrimination included LGBTQ identity. And it should, because the reason that you're discriminated against because you're queer is because of your sexual orientation. And if you had a different gender, you wouldn't be discriminated against. And that's the same for gender identity. Bostock said that protection based on your sex would extend to LGBTQ people. And then in the Biden administration, he extended that. So not just in employment, but he extended it across other agencies. So that provided perhaps the most protection for LGBTQ people in all of life. And we also know that people still get discriminated against because they are LGBTQ. That means that they can go to court and, have a very good shot of winning and settling and getting some money. But if you are someone that doesn't have, the year to put into that, that might not be a hard thing. So something similar with the Equality Act, it would mean that there are protections there in place, but it doesn't stop discrimination for us. But it would be an enormous thing for us to get past, and we want to work really hard to do that. This current administration said if it ever got to his desk, he'd be happy to sign it. I'm sure another administration would, and I'm sure another administration wouldn't. So there we go. We're a C3 over here.
Hi there. My name's AT. Thank you for the work that you do and for a fabulous presentation. I was really struck by how much your organization has had to adapt and kind of shift strategies as new opportunities and challenges have presented themselves. I'm curious, like when an organization like an activist law firm needs to be so responsive to the challenges that are immediately happening, how do you maintain a long-term vision for your organization and goals and like a cohesive organizational identity?
That is an excellent question, because because it's a hard thing to do. One of the most one of the most amazing things about NCLR, I sort of alluded to us being a really small organization, and we are small for a national organization. But what you get from that is we're also really nimble. There's not a ton of red tape you have to get through. If we have some policies around things that are a problem, if we're talking about it, yeah, we have to do this. It's not convincing a whole lot of people. It's, yeah, we have to do this. And so being able to do that makes us really nimble. It means that we can follow something quickly. We can do the right thing, And so that's something that's really, that makes that really good for us. And there are definitely times where, I was talking to my legal director today. He was talking to someone and they're like, this person wants us to basically change our strategy completely around. And that can be really hard too, because like, when do you change your strategy completely around, and when you and when don't you do that? And that part is hard. When these conversations happen, we have to think about what is our vision around these things. And more than anything, I think about our organization. I say this to our group: we are the most progressive, pragmatic organization that you're going to find. And we have to find ways to include more of us, and we have to do it in a way that actually will get something done. Because, if I were just being me, I am a fairly progressive person. And so there's a lot of things that I would do if it was just me. But it's not just me. I'm not just a girl with a clipboard. There is an organization that has a history, but also, like I said before, doesn't have an ego, doesn't have feelings. The organization can create a foundation so that we can protect people. And I said something about this, but just to put a finer point on it, people's lives are in the balance on if I decide to say something a certain way or not. If I just to try to be a little bit too smart when I say this, or do something in a way where I'm not bringing someone in and I am just saying, well, we're going to do this my way or nothing else. I have to remember that the things that we are doing, we are holding people's lives in our hands. And so when we think about it like that, it's to be as pragmatic as possible. But really, what we want is for LGBTQ people to have full lived equality. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we're doing it in an intersectional way. And so there are these tenets that we think through about, okay, it doesn't work for LGBTQ people to have full equality if they don't have the economic power to actually access these systems, if they're experiencing racism in such a way where this precedent isn't going to work for them. So we try to be thoughtful about our plaintiffs, the folks that we use. And, not everyone does that, but there are a lot of times that there are plaintiffs that everyone doesn't think are easy. There are sometimes that there are, we had a case once where there was a young person who was being bullied because of his LGBTQ identity, because of his trans identity. And he fought back. And it didn't make him a like the plaintiff that everyone would want to take, but it was one for us. And I thought that was something that was really important for us. But part of that was an intersection between his trans identity and his racial identity, And so doing all of these things together, and, sometimes we just need to think about it. We need to think about it. We need to go back. And sometimes you have to make concessions about things for the greater good, and you have to figure out what that is for you.
You mentioned, thank you. You mentioned a lot about like navigating language in your role. And so like as a lot of students are beginning to like receive their ballots and like send them back in the election, it can be sometimes a little bit overwhelming in the way that certain policies are worded, because one thing can say something and mean something completely different. Yeah. So aside from simply doing like basic Googling and things like that, do you have any advice for like what it means to navigate the language of policy?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because, that is, like it or not, that's part of the strategy too, to make it a little bit to intimidate us a bit, so that some of us don't feel as comfortable voting for something. We also see the part of the strategy is keeping that everyone has the right to vote, except we know that, there are some folks that work really hard to gerrymander and to rewrite lines so that our vote doesn't mean the same. And it's harder for some people to get in line, to take time off work. There's lots of things there. I have a friend that does something that's actually, I'd never thought about this before, but she brings people together and they like like-minded folks, and they all get together, they hang out, and then you have one policy that you research right then and there with your group of people, and you go back and forth doing the research, and then you argue this point in front of the friends and the people that you care about. And I thought that was a really interesting way of doing it. A way that I think is a faster way is a lot of times finding the organizations that have C4s. Equality Illinois is out here, and they do, I believe they do a ballot initiative. I find organizations that mean something to you, and then let them help, let them lead you in the right place, and then do a little research for it. It's one of those things. You can only do what you can do. So do what you can do. And when you can do a little more, do a little more. And I think something that, like, an easier way to start when you're feeling a little intimidated is starting with some organizations you trust and see how they're voting on some initiatives and why, and then do a little bit of research yourself and just start building into that. One of the things that I think of as a non-lawyer coming into this, like, it's really intimidating. Say, wow, I need to learn a lot of things and I have no idea how to do that. But the truth is, you kind of just start somewhere and then go into it. And as you start reading these a little bit more, then it gets a little bit easier to do it. And then, if you start watching like a little bit of news a day, that was definitely a practice for me, because I'd read news, but then you kind of only get what is put in front of you. But I try to watch like at least an hour of news a day, and that has been helpful for me too. Like, just to, news is biased, but it is hard to hear things without a context, and at least if you know what that context is, if you're watching MSNBC, you know what that is. If you're watching Fox News, you know what that is. You know where the bias is, so you know what you're getting. And I think that's something that I really appreciate. Yeah. My goodness, forgive me. Absolutely. So a nonprofit organization is like a 501c3, and that means that you can't have any sort of lobbying activities. You can't, I can't go and say, this is who you should vote for, because we can't do that. Now, there is a little loophole that if you are a C3, there's a little loophole, you can get a 501h election. I'm saying this because maybe you all want to have your own nonprofit, but you can get a 501h election, and it means that you can do a little bit of lobbying. You can do 20% of lobbying, but, and we do have an H election, but we do try not to, we don't endorse candidates. And a C4 is someone that has, like, a lot of times you'll have a C3 and a C4, or just a C4. And that means that you lobby all the time. You endorse candidates. You very much talk about politics. You say, we should vote for this person and we shouldn't vote for this person. This person is good and this person is bad, in ways that C3s don't really do. That's a great question. Thanks so much. I didn't realize I mentioned that.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I have a question that I think can maybe bridge my own curiosity about this and hopefully speak to for the students and the undergraduate students. But I am finishing a PhD. I'm getting ready to go in the job market, and a lot of the job applications I'm looking for are like, how do you plan on engaging your students, like, with organizations in the real world? How do you plan on partnering with community or with organizations like yourself? And I'm wondering if you see any role specifically for the work of like undergraduates and perhaps faculty members or other people in the university, because we're not lawyers yet. And I know that like law schools have a model where there's clinic work and they might partner with a law firm. But is there a space of like work for like people in this room for getting into the pipeline, and what kind of like, what might that look like, or what might you encourage there?
Oh, I love that. I love that. So there are, some organizations have fellowships for specifically those things, and some people have volunteer experiences. We don't do volunteers anymore. Like, all of our positions are paid because, equity. But it's sometimes I forget that there's kind of a little joke there. Yeah. But something I think is important, like I said before, I went to SSA, and when I worked at the Broadway Youth Center, we would have students come in. And I remember one of the things that I used to say, and I thought this was really important on the first day, I would say, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are doing the very best we can for young people, that we are listening to community. Because when you go to big fancy schools and you professionalize something that had previously been done far better than we're doing it by people in community, and you're making it impossible for them to do that, you do owe something to community. And it's important to recognize these things and figuring out what it is that you want to do to what you want to do. Like that is a system that is a difficult one to change. And a lot of times we feel like we have to be in it. So you have to find where you fit and do your thing. But that said, people can do anything. I really appreciate it, Petra. The work that you're doing. You're writing legislation, and you're not a lawyer. Like that happens. You can write legislation and not be a lawyer. That you can have someone. The decisions I make. The thing that makes it possible for me to do my job, is just having done it before and just kind of trusting my instincts. And I think that anyone in this room could do that exact same thing. So I also believe that anything we want to be done, we can do it. I wonder if it's something too with like, I think it'd be kind of cool to build a curriculum of sorts that's really just building what I think would be interesting. Now, this would be a really cool thing to ask students, but I think what I would want to start with was like, what would it look like to build something where they got to try a little bit of everything in whatever this thing is? Because what they might find is that someone's like, oh, I think I want to be an executive director. And they're like, oh no, wow, you can look at budgets. Like I want to be a finance person, And I think it'd be really cool to have a little bit of touch on everything, especially for undergrad, because I feel like I know that I felt like I had to immediately come in and pick a major when I didn't really know anything. And I just kind of what I like, but there's some stuff that I knew that I would like if I just tried it. And so I wonder if it's something like that, but yeah.
I always think the law school like clinic model is like really interesting. You get this like on the ground supervised work.
Yep.
And it can be a really nice way to partner and provide research or other things for an organization like that.
Absolutely. And we do some of that too. We have law clerks right now and have very specific things that they do. But honestly, what someone gets the most out of, I think, is we always hear that people love doing hotline work. They love to hear what are the things that people are calling about and have interest in. And they also get to understand, like, wow, there's a lot of people calling from Florida right now. What's going on in Florida? And you're like, oh, got it. But then you also see where the holes are, like where the gaps are, and I find that people figure out something they want to do. Sometimes it's not being a lawyer, but sometimes it's something that has to do with something they learned through that hotline. So I wonder if there's a way, like obviously like working closely with someone, but a way where you have access to more things, That's where I'd start. But yeah. Oh yeah.
For gay marriage became legal.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have opportunities to do that, I highly encourage hotline work, even if it seems like something that's outside your.
I love that. GLAD, single A GLAD. Yeah, so GLAD, GLBT legal or defender. Yes. Yeah, and they have been doing more national work. That's who we actually do the most collaborative work that we do. Like so when we did these medical bans I talked about, we worked really closely with GLAD for our Kentucky ban, and the Tennessee ban, ACLU and Lambda work together. Now we all switch and do, all switch and do anything, but we do work really, really closely to GLAD. They're our folks. Yeah, they are.
I'm afraid we are at time, but please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if you come by me, I'd be happy to answer your question. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me.